All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm James Hatt, the designated federal officer for COMSTAC, Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee. This is an open meeting, and if you will show that next slide, please. All right, thank you. This meeting is being held as a reminder pursuant to a notice published in the Federal Register on June 20th, 2023. The agenda for the meeting was announced in that notice with details as set out in the agenda posted on the COMSTAC website. I am the designated federal officer responsible for compliance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, under which this meeting is conducted. It is my responsibility to see to it that the agenda is adhered to and that accurate minutes are kept. I also have the responsibility to adjourn the meeting should I find it necessary to do so in the public interest. Only Commercial Space Transportation Advisory Committee members may participate in discussions and vote on matters put to a vote by the chair. There are some updates to the agenda which have been posted. I have approved those changes at the request of the chair. Thank you very much, and let me turn the meeting over to the chair of COMSTAC, Karina Dries. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us again today as we wrap up our discussions and tasks from the spring meeting. I look forward to a good discussion on our final task, which will be presented shortly by our regulatory working group. I invite everyone to turn on cameras as I introduce our guest speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Michael O'Donnell, the FAA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Commercial Space Transportation. Mr. O'Donnell is responsible for directing AST's daily operations and overseeing and enabling safe space transportation. He has over 35 years of civil and military aviation experience, 15 of which have been served as a senior executive with the FAA. Mr. O'Donnell holds a master's in aeronautical science and a bachelor's in professional aeronautics. In addition to being an adjunct professor at Embry-Riddle, he's a private pilot and accredited airport executive. Welcome, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Karina. Thank you, Jim, for leading the discussion for COMSTAC today. Good to see you all. I'm starting to recognize faces now and getting to know a lot of people, having been around in AST for over a year now and really diving into all the exciting things that we do. Just so you know, we just recently got off a call this morning with Office of Management and Budget. The Deputy Secretary, who is also the acting administrator, briefed out on all things FAA and all things Department of Transportation. And one of the focus areas was commercial space. So Kelvin Coleman presented to the leadership at OMB on what we're doing in the Office of Commercial Space and then the industry as well. So it's getting a lot of traction, as I think you all know, from the Hill, from the administration, from industry, of course, a lot of work that we're doing together. I think it's going to be really good. So on that note, just thank you all for joining us today as we continue. This is a discussion from the May COMSTAC meeting agenda. At this meeting, we're going to focus on Part 450 and prioritizing any recommended regulation changes and rulemaking. So when we develop regulations, we have to do several things. One, we have to consider the safety benefit versus the cost and regulation burden to the industry. That's part of the Administrative Procedures Act of rulemaking. And also how that impacts innovation on what you all as operators in the industry do. So we want to encourage the industry to participate in the rulemaking activity through the advisory committees like this one, the COMSTAC, and the public comment process as well. This is super important that we get the input from you and from industry as well. So 2 years ago, we completed the overhaul of our launch and reentry regulations called Part 450. It replaced some other prescriptive public safety requirements that were out there for a while. And this has exchanged those prescriptive regulations with performance-based regulations. So that's the way Part 450 was designed, to allow the operator to obtain a license for a portfolio of operations. And this would include different vehicle configurations, different mission profiles, or even different multiple sites under one license. So to accomplish that, we shifted our oversight approach from mission by mission approvals to approvals of processes and methods. I think, though, the industry has yet to realize the benefits of 450 because it's very forward-looking regulation, and it's preparing for the environment that's almost here, but not quite. So the applicants for the first 4 Part 450 licenses we have were granted to date scope their request for a single launch of a single vehicle to accommodate the tests of new vehicles. At the licenses that get these first launches, as the licensees get these first launches, and the companies operate under a legacy license, they transition over to Part 450. We expect them to move toward a process-based approach that the rule really was designed to do. So this will require significant effort on our part and yours as well as we do these performance-based rules. So it's worth noting that there are currently 24 active FAA vehicle licenses. 20 of them will need to transition to the license under Part 450 before the deadline of March of 2026 if they intend to keep flying. So it'll be a significant amount of work for our office to transition that many licenses. So for this reason, we really encourage any applicants that are out there to start early, several months early ahead of the 180-day evaluation period would be very beneficial to ensure we can complete that work in time to support your flight plans. So we believe that 3 years provides the operators sufficient time if they begin the process early. And we always want to continue to be better at what we're doing. That's one of our core values, as Kelvin talked about, how we apply our lessons learned to become a learning organization and apply it to all aspects of what we do, especially with rulemaking. So one of the best ways we can do that to ensure safe space transportation is having the right rules at the right place at the right time that strike the right balance between safety and the regulatory burden. And this is where you come in to help us do that. The industry is growing, of course, and innovation is moving at a record pace, and we want to make sure that we move too with that. And these opportunities are also challenges too. So to make sure that we have a really strong partnership between the FAA and industry to make sure that we fulfill that mission and we do it right, do it properly, do it efficiently without overburdening the industry, but at the same time keeping the safety of the uninvolved public at our forefront, and certainly national security and national interest and foreign policy issues up front as well. So with that, thank you for letting me join you today and kick off the meeting and finish our COMSTAC agenda. So I'll turn it back over to Mr. Hatt for the rest of the show.
All right, sir. Thank you. And just as a comment out there, does anybody on COMSTAC have a question for Mike O'Donnell?
Just a quick question, Mike. I wanted to clarify something you said. So you mentioned that members of industry should start several months early, but then I thought I heard you say, but 3 years would provide sufficient time if they start the process early. So just want to make sure I captured your points there, because there's a big difference between several months and 3 years.
Right. The 3 years is the March 2026 requirement in the rule. That's what that's referring to. I would say start now. If you can. Not all operators can start right now, but we want to start as soon as possible. They built that into the rule to have a ramp up towards 450. So anybody coming after that day will have to use 450. So we're in this point of transition right now. The point is to try to move that those folks into transitioning sooner rather than later.
And one other question on the point of time that it's taking. So you mentioned that there have been 4 operators that have been licensed under 450 for essentially single vehicle licenses rather than operators licensed by virtue of their approach to applying. I know that at least 2 of those took more than the 180 days. Can you speak to whether or not that was true for all 4 or just for 2 of the 4?
I don't know that all 4 were. I have to go back and check. We take the 180 date very seriously. And we also do tolling as well, which if the operator is not ready and they need a pause, then we would toll as well. So we'll get back to you on the other 2.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Because it's certainly notable that it's taking a significant amount of time beyond the statutory time, including through the use of tolling. So thanks for that.
Right. So I would add to this, Karen, FAR Part 23, which was also a performance-based rule for aircraft certification, we ran into the same issue, right? Performance-based is a great concept, but if you don't have the standards set aside for people to follow so they know what victory looks like, it becomes bring me a rock. And that's what we're trying to avoid. This is why we're trying to improve 450. It's very forward-looking, but we also need those standards as well. And I think I would encourage the industry, we need to really work on what does victory look like, what do standards look like, so we know that, all right, here's a package that we know will work in this regulatory regime. We've done it before. Here's an example. And I think as you grow the industry, as you grow the licensing process, I think that would be a really great thing for us to be able to provide you. Here's what a successful package looks like under 450. Here's what they did right. Here's what they shouldn't have done, and grow from that so that we have better regulatory performance.
Mike?
See, yes, sir. I see Dr. Neal has his hand up, and I think Ted had a question as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Neal.
Yes, thank you. So I know today is primarily focused on Part 450, but Michael, while you're here, I just think the group would be very interested in a quick status on the SPARC for human spaceflight regulations in terms of charter, government industry chairman membership, and schedules for the next step, just as a status of where we are.
Yeah, I'll kick that over to Jim because that's under Jim's shop. So Jim, take it away.
So I have to admit, I was looking at the questions that just came in, since you were asking Michael about that. So I apologize, George. Could you re-ask that question and I will answer? I apologize.
Yes, just hoping for a real quick status on the SPARC for human spaceflight safety in terms of members and chairs and schedule, next steps.
Yes. The first meeting, kind of the kickoff, saying the ground rules happened at the end of June. The next meeting is July 27th. Min Nguyen is the government chair or co-chair. Mary Lynn Dittmar is the industry co-chair, and we are working on clearly identifying the tasks for the SPARC. We have the big strategic pieces that were done in the charter, which I believe is published out on the web. But getting down a little bit more specifics, we're finishing up those things so that the 460 SPARC can really get started and dig in. And we expect the report to be done about 12 months from now.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And Jim, for your information, I just told Wendy I will kick that one off as well too on the 27th. So you'll hear from me again on the 27th. So okay, General Mercer, go ahead, sir.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. I can't operate my camera. It's under the control on your end. So, but I do see you well, so it's good to see you. There's just two questions. One is, I know that for a period of time, AST was challenged with just manpower resources, right? And I know that there was that I think the Hill provided some allocation to help you hire people. That my first question is, how's that coming? Are you getting healthier on the manpower side?
Yeah, yes, we are. So there was a nice surprise. And by the way, you did pop up. I saw you're now visible. Nice vest. We did get a nice surprise back in December, right? 27 up to, well, actually it was up to 40 full-time employees that we could hire, but they didn't give us the money for 40. We have probably the money for maybe 27 or 26, or it's in the 20s. And so we're vigorously hiring and you'll see it on LinkedIn to bring people on. In fact, we just got a briefing this morning on where we are. We hope to top out around 155. I don't know that we'll get there by September. Here's the challenge, right? The jobs, it's so hard to get people to say yes because they're so much in need all across the industry. We do a lot of work to make an offer, and sometimes they say, "Oh, I got a better offer from another company." So that's been a challenge, but we've brought on over a dozen so far, and things are going well. Although I think by September, we're really got to spool up. We have a number of that are in security that, having worked the FAA, they got to run through all the traps of security as well too. So it's going good, but it can always go faster. And certainly that'll be enough to get us through the next year or so, but we need to talk about beyond that too, and how we can answer the mail going forward and keep, asking for your support as you all talk to the Hill about resources for AST.
Okay, great. That's very encouraging. I thank you for that. I'm glad to hear that, and I'm more than happy to help carry that banner on the Hill as we make our runs at the Hill. The other question I had was, are we making progress on basically the kind of the rub between the fact that the FAA now clearly has responsibility for flight safety, but the federal ranges, I think, still want to play in the flight safety role, and really causes some complication for the customer, trying to please two masters, as it were. Are we making any progress on that front? That's my last question.
Excellent question. Any safety question is the best question. We just recently met last week with Lieutenant General Burt from U.S. Space Force. And on my list of questions for her it really wasn't a question, it was a statement: range safety. We want to make sure, as the Air Force / Space Force works to really build up their throughput at the ranges, that the safety is top priority for them and for us, and we're all speaking the same language. And I think that's really important to make sure that as we do more and more launches from these ranges, that the expectations are there, that what the ranges are doing for safety is what the FAA is expecting, and vice versa. What the operators are doing is what the range is looking for, and make sure they're all communicating. We had some good lessons learned recently on that, as you know, and we want to make sure that we take these lessons to other ranges as well. And not only that, but think about the number of ranges we have. What about increasing more use at the ranges that aren't as busy, like, for example, at Wallops? And how does that, how do we make that work for everybody, especially to deal with civil, military, and commercial, all working in the same area? So range safety is top priority for us. We have a great safety record. Knock on wood. We want to make sure the uninvolved public never gets injured or worse by a launch. So that's always going to be our top priority. But General Burt committed to that. And certainly, as she oversees both the ranges from the Space Force side of the house, she's a lieutenant general in DC. She committed to working with us more on that. And our folks are certainly wanting to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. So we'll keep the heat up on that, as we say, Ted, and make sure that we don't back off on that, especially as the cadence increases and we see more and more launches. The pressure to get work done and to move stuff through the widget machine, that safety remains top priority, which in the FAA, as you know, always is number one.
Thank you.
Sir.
All right, I don't see any other questions. So Karina, back to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, appreciate you being here and sharing a lot of your thoughts with us.
Thank you.
So as we continue our discussion from the spring meeting, I'd like to turn over the presentation to Karen Shennewerk, Chair of the Regulatory Working Group, to discuss the 450 task. And just for folks to know, we have ample time for discussion with this task, so please feel free to chime in with your comments and questions along the way, or certainly at the end of the presentation when Karen wraps up. So Karen, over to you. And John, if you can display the slides, that would be phenomenal.
All right, thank you. All right, so this was the second task. First, I'll do a comms check though. Karina, can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. All right, so this was the second task for the regulatory working group, and it was focused on the Part 450 question. So what does COMSTAC believe would require additional clarification with regard to 450 by the FAA or regulatory change? And if recommended, of course, a question about prioritization of that Part 450 rulemaking in light of some of the other rulemakings that are underway. And I'll note that, the task referenced Part 440, but of course, as just noted, there is a Part 460 spark underway, and we now have a Part 440 spark underway. So those activities are ongoing, but we certainly did work to answer the question in light of the idea of overall, demand on the FAA for regulation. All right, next slide. So just some background for those who aren't familiar. The final rule for Part 450, establishing Part 450, was adopted in December 2020. The rulemaking effort for Part 450 started with discussions with the National Space Council in 2018. A notice of proposed rulemaking was published in 2019 and then moved to final rule in 2020. In the scheme of rulemaking, this is actually quite fast. And that actually is, I think, was the root of many comments that are a part of the docket and the record with regard to Part 450 efforts. So, one of the things that we didn't see that, could have been done, for example, was to do a revised notice of proposed rulemaking following on the comments, but there was a desire to move quickly. So that time frame from 2018 to 2020 was pretty fast. And put a lot of pressure on the industry to respond, and of course on the FAA to develop something and publish something and then need to implement it pretty quickly. Because the effective rule, as noted here, the effective date, as noted here, was March 10th, 2021. So pretty quick turn from implementing a significant change to performance-based regulations, as Mike O'Donnell just noted, from the prescriptive regulations that were in 415, 417. So when talking about, for example, the operators that continue to launch under existing licenses, of course, that's a reference to licenses that were issued under those prior rules, which have now been replaced by 450, but we have standing licenses that are still active and the ability to move those through. The rule did call for, to the extent that there are material changes to licenses issued under the existing the prior rules, 415, 417, 431, because reentry was also part of it, that you would then shift to Part 450, depending on a significant shift in your licensing. We're not really seeing that happen, so that wasn't something that members of industry reported happening. So far, the Part 450 licenses, the 4 that have been issued, were issued for new operations, new versions of vehicles. Those include Relativity's Terran 1 launch, SpaceX's Starship, I believe ABL, and I'm missing one. It was either Astra or Firefly. Sorry, I just dropped that from my mind. I just lost it. Okay, so those are the 4 that have occurred. It was drafted to replace prescriptive regulations, as noted, and give industry greater flexibility. Any questions or comments on this background that folks want to add to the discussion today? Okay. Next slide. So in reviewing the status of 450, the activity around it, of course, one of the things that has occurred is the issuance of advisory circulars, which are key. So Michael O'Donnell mentioned standards. I think I meant to ask the question that he was referring to guidance documents from the FAA. So guidance on how an operator might provide information to the FAA, whether that's your methodologies or the actual, your review of your safety systems in a manner that would be acceptable to the FAA. Of course, there's the goal of 450 is to be able to accept, alternative ideas so that each operator could come in with its own approach, which makes it, of course, quite burdensome on the FAA to process. And really, we'll talk about some of the challenges that can face, that they are facing and that we're all facing. But it is notable that there have been 4 vehicle operators license issued. They've licensed in total. The FAA licensed and permitted 74 launches and reentries in 2022. Only one of those was under Part 450. The other ones occurred in 2023. And then 15 advisory circulars have been issued providing guidance on Part 450 compliance. An important note about advisory circulars, of course, is that they can be revised without being subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. So one of the things that in talking to the FAA about 450 and the advisory circulars, is of course the encouragement for anybody in industry, if you have concerns or feedback on them, to please provide that, and they can go through revision process to the extent that they have the resources to dedicate to that. And of course, as noted, dozens of applications are underway under review with the FAA. So there are the future applications that are the applications from vehicles if they need to update their license. So if those vehicles continue to fly and operate, they'll need to move to 450, in addition to the new vehicles that are pending application status and planning to fly this year and into the future, and will be subject to 450 as a result of their timing. So those are some of the observations. Next slide. Notably, the FAA has exceeded the 180-day statutory timeframe for licensing. So, this is not definitively indicative of a problem, but it certainly is something to take note of in the course of the FAA's ability to implement 450, that despite the use of tolling, the 180-day statutory timeframe for licenses has been, been I would say violated. That sounds a little harsh, but has not been met, I guess I should say. Vehicle operators identified a variety of issues with the requirements and its implementation. We'll get into those as part of the report. And the FAA is was requesting $42 million for FY24. That was a significant increase over the FY23, and that budget request further full-time employees, as we talked about. And we understand that some of those would be dedicated to 450 implementation and compliance. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Any questions on the last slide or comments? Okay, next slide. All right, so findings. These are the things that we discovered or discussed in the course of developing a report. The publication of advisory circulars is important. So we, as previously discussed, in order to comply with Part 450 and performance-based regulations, guidance is incredibly important and helpful. Another, of course, note is that no vehicle can launch or re-enter at a spaceport without a vehicle operator's license. So a spaceport license does not authorize launch or re-entry operations. This is notable in the course of thinking about priorities for regulatory reform. That is to say that if the FAA does not have a functioning approach to licensing launch and re-entry operations, then regardless of whether it can license a spaceport, no operations could occur at a spaceport if you don't have operators and vehicle licenses. Applicants report that instead of allowing for diverse approaches that were tailored to the vehicle, 450 application has been done in such a manner that has driven applicants towards strict requirements. So in certain places, we've seen the FAA say, well, this is the way that if you do it this way, the way that it's kind of been done before, then, you can get through the process. And that is counter to, the goal of Part 450, which would allow for flexibility and give the FAA's ability to review different approaches that might have public safety benefit, for example. Any questions or comments? Okay, next slide. All right. Applicants also reported that Part 450 subjects reentry applicants to requirements that are not applicable or appropriate. So an important point about Part 450 is that it combined launch and reentry. So it took 415, 417, and the reentry license regime, and it the reentry licensing regime, and it combined them all into Part 450. There are some places, and the report that the committee, that the working group, I should say, developed has some specific feedback on specific rule sections, and this is the subject of some of those where the requirements were not clear on reentry, or that the regulation could benefit from clarification with regard to the applicability to reentry, and this is the finding that ties to that recommendation. The FAA licenses benefit from process improvements that would reduce application review timeframes and increase transparency, pretty self-evident. And as they receive an increasing number of applicants, there is certainly concern that delaying the perfection of Part 450 will be damaging going forward. So for those 20 operators or vehicles that are pending, they certainly would benefit the FAA and the licensees from a perfection of 450 prior to their need to shift to 450, because we believe that this will result in more efficient implementation of the regulation. All right, next slide. And so the recommendations, which are derived from the observations and findings. So ensuring that advisory circulars are accurate and accommodate variations. They should make distinctions between launch and reentry when differences exist. Recommendation that FAA revise 450 to address challenges with requirements that are distinct to launch or reentry. So one is the ACs, two is the Part 450 actual regulations. And then distinguishing between at least including distinct sections discussing the difference in applicability of many of the regulations. Then, of course, more transparency into software and analysis tools. This is an issue that was raised previously. It continues to be raised with regard to the oversight and licensing of launch and reentry. That the use of software and analysis tools for reviewing applicants' materials certainly would benefit from more transparency so that applicants can efficiently develop a plan for developing their means of compliance for things like flight safety analysis and toxic release analysis. So understanding how the FAA would processes those could certainly help industry develop them more efficiently and also discover any issues that would lead to improved safety. Any questions or comments? Next slide. All right, developing and implementing a change control process for technical standards would be helpful. That process should account for the impact of changing technical standards during an ongoing licensing effort. Licensees reported seeing this occur, so they would be marching in a certain direction with their license, and then have the FAA tell them that they needed to shift direction and that new guidance was coming but had not been published yet or had been changed but was not, the applicant was not aware. So I think in a way to make sure that everybody is working from the most current information and also that there's transparency and accountability about changes to that. Implementation include identification of keys, roles, and expertise within the FAA required to evaluate license applications in a performance-based framework. This recommendation is derived from concern about the ability of FAA to the current state of FAA staffing, which is to say that folks within the FAA certainly seem quite stretched. So hopefully the new hires that are being discussed in the funding that has been approved will help address this, and that funding and those new hires will be directed towards Part 450 implementation. And that the people that have those abilities, the engineering and analysis capabilities, will be identified so that there's an ability to have interchanges with industry in an efficient manner, so as to diminish a game of essentially telephone between one person at the FAA who's gone 3 levels through to get to an analysis and to get to somebody who's doing the analysis and then telephoning it all the way back to a licensee. So the more frequent use of technical interchange meetings is, I think, an aspect of this recommendation. Also prioritizing 450 clarification reforms to ensure it's prepared to efficiently and effectively manage an increasing number. So that also goes to staffing. It also goes to the processes that the agency uses. But there certainly was a lot of discussion and input on the committee's report with regard to the importance, again, of the FAA having the folks that could go essentially toe to toe with industry in being able to explain the FAA's regulations, evaluate the applicant's materials, and provide clear and concise feedback on those materials. And that time frame that's taking, certainly the referring back to the finding with regard to the 180 days is indicative of a concern around that efficient feedback loop. One, applicant's ability to understand 450, right? Is there enough guidance? Is there enough technical information? And then 2, the FAA's ability to intake the information that's provided and then evaluate that and adjudicate it. All right, any questions or comments on this slide? If not,
Hey,
next slide. Go ahead.
This is Jay. I actually wanted to see if we can go back 1 slide and ask a question about the previous recommendation. So I was actually thinking about this a little bit, but the part where the AC should allow for variability and prevent regulatory burdens and allow for essentially different types of vehicles. I guess, is there any way that we can get a little more specific on our recommendation to sort of help FAA do that. 'Cause I don't know if it's helpful to just say, do this better. I wonder if there's anything that we can do. One of the ideas that I had was, I remember back with 431, there was a pretty heavy emphasis on the CONOPS, rather than focusing on the variabilities of the vehicles themselves, but focusing on the different flight profiles that different designs of vehicles can take. I think could be really helpful to contain the problem in a meaningful way, instead of trying to address all the different types of vehicle design variations that could be possible. I mean, there's so many permutations of that. Maybe regulation can just frame the CONOPS.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess, Karina, Jim, for this, we have a more thorough written report for which these are summary slides. Should we be concerned with trying to capture that here in the recommendation slides bullets, or should we make sure that that is captured in the report that is finalized?
I would say make sure it's captured in the report. But if there are questions from COMSTAC members, I'll leave it up to Karina, but it may be worth at least talking through some of those additional points. But Karina, over to you.
So yes, I agree. Like, we can definitely update the white paper. That's really where the content will be delivered back to AST. I would personally love to be able to close this task out so that we can have the regulatory working group focus on other tasks going forward. We have the time, if you all are willing, we could see if we can make some revisions in real time. If we find that it's just too cumbersome, we can definitely take it offline and continue working on the white paper. So Jay, if you want to, do you have language to suggest in making the change to see if we can try to do that in real time and see if we can get folks to agree? I'd love to be able to vote on the recommendations at least, and then we can continue working on the white paper if that's possible.
Yeah, and to chime in, so the specific bullet in the report speaks to the fact that in combining licensing and launch and reentry operations, Part 450 subjects reentry applicants to numerous requirements that are not applicable or appropriate. The FAA should revise Part 450 to address challenges with requirements that are distinct to launch or reentry. Similarly, ACs should distinguish between launch versus reentry license requirements, or at least include distinct sections discussing the differences in applicability of many of the regulations.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what we can maybe specify. Where my mind, I'm just kind of thinking out loud, where my mind is going is if FAA can clarify the aspects of the different variations that are actually important to regulation, as opposed to kind of leaving that open-ended. I think that's kind of what this recommendation is trying to address.
And I think that's a fair point, one that is actually true regardless of launch or reentry, right?
Right.
So I think that's something that we could even make sure that we address in the just the overall feedback on advisory circulars with regard to 450.
Yes. Because I think my what's going through my mind is I would rather FAA communicate to industry the factors that are important where they have absolute clarity and detailed information, as opposed to trying to do a design review or something like that. I mean, some things just don't matter if the engineering soundness may not matter if it doesn't impact public safety, for example. So I don't want to. Yeah, so let me think about some language. I don't want to hold up the discussion here, but I'll try to come up with something.
Okay. That sounds great. I'm thinking something that we could add, that AC should clearly communicate the critical factors for review of the safety, something along those lines. So yeah, okay. If you want to iterate on that, and then we can make sure that that gets added. But I think that, does anybody have any concern with reflecting that sentiment in our recommendations? All right, great. Thank you, Jay. I appreciate you raising that and making sure that we're clear on that point. Okay, so next slide, I think we were on 12. All right, any questions or comments here? We went back one. If not, we'll move forward to the next.
I think that's it.
I think that's it too. All right, great.
Okay, so we circulated the white paper beginning of the month-ish, and we did get a couple of comments back on the white paper from a member. I guess what we can do at this point, if we want to continue sort of iterating on some of the recommendations or some of the language, we'll get that white paper circulated back again. If folks are sort of in agreement with that, if you could also let me know that would be really helpful. If you want to spend a little bit more time thinking about it, we can do that as well. Does anyone else have any concerns or questions they want to raise with this topic?
Hey, Chris, this is Mike. I mean, just to your point earlier, if there is something we could in real time add from Jay's perspective, or Karen, if something you could add here that would capture that and we can vote on it. I'm assuming, Karina, that what you received in the white paper did not change these recommendations. I mean, if that's the case, I would suggest if we can in the next few minutes here come up with some language we think gets there, at least take a run at trying to close this out. Given this was already a follow-on meeting to the spring COMSTAC.
Yeah, I'll note that the comments that we received were more just cleanup, like minor edits, suggestions of like changing an and to an as well as kind of thing. I reviewed them and feel very confident that they were not substantive. So I think, to the extent that we want to add a bit of a clarifying comment around the ACs, which would be to the extent that you have the report perhaps in front of you, I would suggest to the first bullet on the second page, in the summary of the feedback. And with that, I think, the report is essentially done, and I would be very pleased to close it out today.
Yeah, that's what I. John, if you want to.
Corinna, were you asking me if I had some comments?
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. Another John. Yeah, so this is, I have a couple comments that, well, I guess, as you guys know from the comments that we've sent in, we have a fundamental disagreement that the regulation should be reopened and changed. And if this is the right time, I'd like to just offer rationale for that position. This is when you want that?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, there's language in here about the perfection of Part 450. I guess that that's a challenge, just that word perfection. I'm not sure we'll ever get to a perfect regulation. But it seems like the majority of issues that have been expressed with the regulation could be resolved with further guidance documents, advisory circulars, etc., or FAA policy documents. For example, the differentiation between launch and entry that's called out in the table a few times there, that could be handled with policy. And so, rather than reopening the regulation and going through that whole process, it seems like we could clarify some of the questions around the regulation with further advisory circulars or policy. So that's one point. It's been discussed. Associate Administrator Donald mentioned it, that 450 was in, and also Karen, in your comments, you mentioned it's written as a performance-based rather than a prescriptive document. And you know, that provides flexibility for providers to provide different solutions, perhaps. In your comments, you mentioned that those aren't necessarily being accepted and they're being driven back to the prescriptive requirements. If that is truly a problem, then that ought to be fixed with the implementation and the process that's being used, rather than perhaps rewriting the regulation. And then I guess the final comment I get is we have a lot of other work for the FAA to focus on here, the sparks associated with 440 and 460, and reopening 450 would certainly detract resources from working on all those. So I guess you know, my overall position is that 450 may not be perfect, but it's good enough to be tweaked with advisory circulars, policies, etc. And let's keep moving forward and figure out how to make it work rather than kind of throwing it out and starting over. So that would be the position that I would have, and those are the reasons. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So I guess quick, where's the, okay. Thank you, John. So the question I would have is would you mind further giving some more context for your concern about the idea of opening the regulation? Is it that you're concerned about the, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I guess, what would be your concern?
A lot of work was put in to get into the regulation to where it is. I think we ought to spend some time shaping it with policy documents, advisory circulars, etc., and focus on making it work as opposed to just starting over with a new one and taking all the resources that it will take, and who knows how long it will take to rewrite the regulation.
So I guess sorry about the feedback. So I guess the question the thing that I think is and true about that is I share your concern about the idea of any kind of duplicative work. It seems to me that the same efforts that would go into perhaps like understanding what about the regulation needs to be, I use the word perfected, sorry, it's a lawyer word, not an engineering word. I should probably avoid lawyering words around engineers. So improved. It's the thing that should be the aspects of it that need to be understood in order to be improved and then documented, for example, in an advisory circular, are the same things that would need to be understood and then documented in a rule change, which doesn't mean that this rule gets thrown away. It means that an update to the rule could be published and could be iterated on, which would then be standing and improved upon in the ability to implement the performance-based rules rather than the iterations of just ACs. And so I think, you know, what's being worked on, and, you know, Jim, to your point, is the idea that there are specific aspects of 450 that applicants have identified that are causing challenges. And I think that, you know, one example of that is the difference between launch and reentry. So an advisory circular can say, well, here's how you could comply with this, but an advisory circular can't change the fact that there may be rules that the FAA reviewers have to follow when looking at a reentry license, because the advisory circular can't tell them not to impose those rules. Because when it goes from the FAA to FAA legal, so when it goes from AST to FAA legal for a compliance review, and those aspects of the regulation haven't been complied with, then we have a problem, and an advisory circular can't be in conflict with the underlying rule. So that's the issue that applicants have brought forward with regard to the need to specifically revise the rule versus being able to update it through advisory circulars. I'm sorry for the feedback, because hearing my voice is the worst thing in the world.
Is there not some policy document that the FAA could put out that would delineate the difference between launch and entry and which regulations apply?
No, legally they have to follow the letter of the regulation. So to the extent that the regulation has requirements that are applicable to reentry applicants, they have to implement those. So I'll say that in my experience in dealing with FAA staff, there are aspects of 450 that even they know would benefit from improvement, because the quickness of the drafting of such an extensive rule certainly may have sacrificed some I was going to say perfection, the benefit, like they certainly didn't let like good enough be the problem. So I think, and I think that there certainly is not an interest in stopping the activities that are happening with 460 or Part 440. I'll note that some of the people that are the experts within the FAA for those activities are different people than are experts on the 450. So I would posit that these things could be worked on in line with each other. I'll also note that of all the things that the FAA does, in my opinion, the licensing of launch and reentry is the core activity and all else flows from it. So if I can't get a license to launch my vehicle, I really don't care that the MPL process is inefficient or that the waiver process is inefficient. And I'm certainly not even going to be able to fly spaceflight participants or crew under Part 460 if I can't get a launch or reentry license to fly my vehicle. So to me, this is the core and foundational question for for what is most important within the FAA's priorities.
100%. And I just want to remind everybody that this task is something that the FAA asked us to look at because of some of the challenges that they recognize industries dealing with 450. So this was an opportunity for industry to provide some of that feedback back to AST so that we can open that conversation in terms of like, what is the best way for everyone to move forward? Some of the things that I'm hearing from folks in industry is, they are working hand in hand with folks at AST. So it's not meant to be sort of like a series of criticisms. It's meant to be like genuine feedback to AST, to the folks that they're working directly with, so that they can find the best way forward for everybody.
Can I go back to the previous AC topic? I think I came up with something. Okay. So I was just looking at another AC just to kind of refresh my memory on some of the maybe ways that we could improve. For the flight safety hazard analysis AC for Part 450, it says something to the extent of a flight hazard analysis identifies key system design and operations data, documents overall system safety risk to the public, and determines the necessary hazard controls, mitigations to ensure the residual risk meets accepted criteria. So, I mean, if we unpack sort of that as like a model for the spirit of ACs, I think one of the ways that we can be more specific with this first bullet recommendation on page 2 is to recommend that maybe FAA specifies the types of systems or operations data that is specifically interesting to ensure public safety. As systems get more complex and as they vary in design, I think getting more specific is necessary so that industry doesn't start spending resources in the wrong direction that can be sometimes detrimental to progress. I understand I fully appreciate the need to kind of be little ambiguous here to allow for flexibility, but there are certain systems by physical law in a launch vehicle that are just not related to public safety. And I think industry can spend a tremendous amount of resources, especially engineers, digging into the details of those systems that sometimes aren't helpful. It creates, and if you submit it, FAA has to review it. And so I think it can kind of burden already stretched resources. So maybe that's one way we can say, specify the types of systems or operations data, like be more specific. Maybe there's a way to classify that operations data as it pertains to how it could impact public safety. That's, I think, more specific. Systems that impact the range, the impact, instantaneous impact point of vehicles. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm trying to kind of capture what you're saying, and I was thinking to try and put something in the chat. I'm not sure if I really got it though. So this is what I got. Maybe you can iterate on that. So I don't think I really got it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. I see a hand raised. Yes, Ted. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Listen, I agree with Jay. I think better specificity, I think, is important to help frame if we're going to talk about a recommendation. I agree with him on that. I think too that we need to recommend to the FAA that they draw a clearer distinction. Jay was saying public safety. I think the distinction is more about flight safety and ground safety, right? I think those are the two delineations, right, that make up public safety, right? Flight safety and ground safety. And I think that the issue here is that for at least some of the ranges, particularly the one at Wallops, there is I'll just say a rub or a disconnect between the way that the federal range at Wallops sees flight safety and their play in that versus what the FAA as the regulator sees the requirement for flight safety and what that should be. And the reason that this is important is that if they're both going to play in flight safety, you are now forcing the customer to deal with two masters, right? You got to deal with the regulator, which is the FAA, who says they own flight safety, but yet you have to deal with the nuances of the range because they believe that they have a role to play in that somehow. You got to clarify that. You either do play or you don't. And let's give the customers one master with which to deal in terms of flight safety. I bring it up because it keeps coming up. It keeps coming up. And the federal ranges are not the regulators. The FAA is the regulator. So I don't know how we fold that in the recommendation, but I think you got to do that. You gotta draw this line so that the customer knows who they're dealing with when it comes to flight safety and ground safety that make up public safety.
Yeah. Go ahead. Karina, were you speaking? Go ahead.
No, you go ahead if you want.
Yeah, I was going to say, I couldn't agree with you more. This is a concern that has been consistently raised and was definitely raised, dating back in the lead up to, efforts to do regulatory reform of launch and reentry activities. I'll say that it's an interesting one, and one that I find a little bit challenging to answer specific to Part 450 in talking to the FAA. I think it's one that is a bit of a more of a kind of whole of government and Comrade Sanders working group, and how like the interplay between the FAA and the range. So I'm absolutely willing to look at how we reflect a concern on Part 450 feedback with regard to that issue. But I do think that that's in some ways a broader issue of the interaction between competing agencies and a question of authorities. But one I could not more wholeheartedly agree that it is something that is a challenge.
So
I think part of the challenge is being driven though by the fact that the FAA will say to you, the customer, that we have responsibility for flight safety, period. Now we've heard the FAA's mid-management leadership say that, and we have heard the assistant administrator for commercial space say that. We are the regulator that has responsibility for flight safety, particularly under 450 licenses, right? And then, but on the other hand, they will say, but having said that, the ranges will have their engagement in the process. And so now you're forcing the customer to deal with two masters on a flight safety issue. That's what I'm scratching at.
Yeah, absolutely. And understood. And I see and have experienced what you're speaking to, as have I think a number of folks on the call. And I'm still kind of struggling with how I suggest to FAA that be a clarification in 450, other than telling them they should keep foot stomping the fact that they have authority over flight safety and they're the only ones that do.
I think, yeah, you enforce it, right? You can develop any rule of law you want, but it's useless if you don't enforce it.
Yeah.
Right. They have to enforce that. And it's in documentation that they have flight safety. They're responsible for it. They got it. So, the guidance needs to come from wherever it needs to come from to the ranges that says you are not involved in flight safety anymore. When we, the FAA, issue a license and are satisfied with the safety analysis, we're done.
So the report does reflect the report in one way reflects one of the flip side of that, which is that where an operator is subject to range requirements, that the ranges reviews and approvals should be accepted by the FAA. And so we certainly have an aspect in here that's that piece of this, because both of these problems exist, right? You have folks that have experience dealing with the range and they find the range to be, they use the range and then want the range materials to be accepted by the FAA. And then the FAA says we have to review that and you have to defend the range's approach. And then, of course, you're speaking to the opposite of that. Megan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, part of what has been touched on is in terms of resource constraints at the FAA, the range brings a lot of expertise and a much bigger budget. So as far as our perspective as a launch operator, if we need to answer to that master on the range because that is their government property, we understand and appreciate that. And we're trying to reduce burden over on AST in the sense that they're already struggling to meet the mandate of, as you pointed out, and the report talks about 180 days and everything else for 450, not even, getting to the other parts and licenses that they're dealing with. So, I wholeheartedly support the recommendation and the points that we have in this paper about having the two jurisdictions work together, reduce overlap and redundancy on jurisdiction, and clarify who's going to review what and how it's accepted by the other entity. So I think that's what AST has been trying to do. I know that Space Force is taking another look at that, and I've seen recent documentation and language about Space Force intending to continue clarifying that.
Yeah, there's a further point to the piggyback on that's different between the Wallops Federal Range and the other two, the Eastern and the Western Range. And that is that the way that the Wallops Range operates is whatever they determine their involvement should be in flight safety, they tend to charge the customer for that. So now the customer gets a bill because NASA says we have to be involved in this process. And this is our review, our recap, our coverage of our analysis, our review of the analysis. Oh, and by the way, customer, here's another bill for you for doing that. And what the customer's view is wait, time out. The FAA is a regulator for flight safety. We have met all of those requirements. The FAA is satisfied. They have issued us a license to launch. And now, because I have to use your range, NASA, you inject yourself into some kind of a review process of what the FAA has already approved, and then I'm gonna give you a bill for that. There's part of the dilemma.
So if I can just kind of jump in here, I feel like we have two very different perspectives on how to move forward with this task. And we can take two different approaches, I suppose, here. We can try to make some of the changes to the recommendations in real time, and try to close this out so we can have the COMSTAC focus on other tasks for the fall versus continue working on this particular task. But if some folks are feeling like, these recommendations, like overall, are things that you cannot support, I'd love to just get a sense from the COMSTAC. How many folks are feeling like overall these are not recommendations that you're willing to support? How many folks tend to agree more with what John's points are?
I think from a Lockheed perspective, Karina, we would like to find some middle ground that's more in line with what John is suggesting, or a counter proposal or some additional ideas along those lines. So I'd like to hear more from ULA.
I would like to chime in and say, I mean, from an operator's perspective, pursuing Part 450, these comments reflect the struggles that we've been dealing with. So I think it's fine to share alternative perspectives, but I would prefer to not diminish what the FAA asked for, in the sense that they were looking for feedback and ways they could improve 450. I think back to the Spark. The charter on the 450 Spark was 6 weeks. The charter for upcoming Sparks are 2 years. It is not a surprise that AST needs to go back and work on revising these regs. And the issues that we have experienced in pursuing these licenses are reflected in this report. And I would like to see them held the way they are and shared with the FAA to include others' perspectives. That's fine. But it is my vote and perspective that we, maintain what we've captured here at least.
Hey, Megan, could we give them the recommendations or the comments that say, here's the issues, here's the struggles people that are having, and just be silent on whether or not the regulation needs to be rewritten in order to solve those. There are perhaps other ways that the issues can be addressed, rather than just opening up the regulation and kind of rewriting it.
I mean, I appreciate
because I don't disagree with the issues that are being raised.
Yeah, I think I am of the mindset that the FAA's expertise and workforce that would be devoted to things like Part 460 and human spaceflight should be separated from Part 450 and current licensing efforts and the regs that they need to modify there. I think I would prefer that if they do need to modify the regs to add clarity for industry as we try to meet those regulations, that we do get that actual clarity in the regs. So staying silent, I guess, gives them the opportunity to still make those changes, but I'm not sure. I would have to think through. I'm not sure I support not supporting those changes to the regs.
This is Mike. I just want to turn to the recommendations here, because I think if we could look at the recommendations themselves, I think number 3 of 8 bullets is the only one that talks about revising regs, and that's the one that has to do with separating launch and reentry, which, as I understand it, legally, that has to be a regulatory revision. The other bullets talk about advisory circulars. They talk about reducing complexity. So I just want to make sure that I want to make sure that if we look at these, the wording of these recommendations, that I want to make sure that there's a comfort or a lack of comfort with this actual wording, because my read of them is not about a wholesale. It is not about a wholesale rewrite of 450. In fact, so like I said, maybe I'm reading these wrong. So, so as I saw these as written, as sort of, iterations and improvements on several of these. So I just want to make sure, if we're talking about, maybe perhaps we could, if we need more time, to propose specific edits to these recommendations, because I want to make sure we're sort of working off the same words.
So Mike, what I'll note is if you'll refer to the report that was circulated, there is a chart that consumes the last couple of pages of the report. It's 5-6 pages long. A number of and it's specific to regulation, specific parts of the regulation, like 450.108, part 450 system safety, part 450 108 flight abort system, part 454.3, and those aspects call for specific revisions of the regulation, because those are aspects of the regulation that applicants who have experience working under 450 have identified as being specifically problematic to their ability to get licenses, and therefore are recommending, in response to the FAA's request, specific changes and specific aspects that need to be updated. So I think that while it's one bullet in the recommendations and a quick paragraph in the report, it's pretty fundamental to answering the mail by the working group, whether or not we respond that, to the question of regulation changes being recommended or not, and how the FAA should prioritize a 450 rulemaking in comparison to rulemakings on 450, 420, and 433. And, the feedback from applicants and from, other members was that this is a high priority, and their points were the ones that I have already made with regard to the fundamental role of the FAA AST and licensing launch and reentry, and the need to do that in the most efficient and effective way possible, particularly with the pipeline of activities. So I certainly could make an argument that if you have your license already, or if you're on the verge of getting your license, then sure, let's not revise these rules. But for the future of our industry and for the betterment of all the activities that we say that we want to facilitate, we need to revise this rule, and we need to put in the effort to make sure that it functions in a manner that can deliver up the type of operational AST and license for public safety launch and reentries in an efficient and effective manner. Because we certainly can't, in my opinion, achieve the future state of operations in our industry without having good, solid regulations and support for regulators being, well-educated, well-trained, and having efficient tools to process those regulations. So that's why those were also considered and recommended as part of the 450 effort.
Hey, just for my understanding, because I'm not as close to this as you are. So I think it took about 2.5 years, even though that was a shortened timeline, to get 450 through the process. If it was opened up and revisited and perfected, how long do you think that would take, and how would folks be licensed in the meantime?
So I'll answer the second question first, which is they would be licensed under existing rules and regulations, so under 450 as it stands, until it is changed through an official rulemaking. So that means that if it took another year or 2 years or 5 years to adopt a final rule with changes to 450, during those 1, 2, or 5 years, the existing regulations.
Karen, can you pause a second? John, would you please use the microphone? We're getting a lot of feedback. Thanks.
Okay, so if it takes 1, 2, 5, 10 years during that time frame, the existing regulations stand and people continue to operate under those. And to the extent that the regulations are changed, they would not operate under new regulations until they had some reason to change. And it's not as if there would be the committee, the working group is not recommending a wholesale, like throw away 450 and do 480 as we happened with 415 and 417. It's take 450 and address amendments to it. This is more similar to the kinds of things that we've seen with the regulations in other parts, so I should say with other parts of the regulations that have occurred for flight in FAA. So for example, the regulations governing financial responsibility, Part 450 that we're now looking at in the Spark, they were originally adopted, I believe, in the 90s. They were updated in like 2010, and now we're looking at updating them again. We will continue to operate under the existing regulations while we work to provide recommendations, and then while the FAA goes through the rulemaking process. So that was a very answer is no change until a notice of proposed rulemaking is published, and then comments are processed on that, and then a final rule is published some amount of time later and enacted into rule. So it will follow the Administrative Procedures Act. So we will have the process will have to follow that. The sooner it gets started, the sooner it ends, and the FAA could then operate under improved rules. But in the meantime, this will stand.
Got it. Thanks.
Matt, were you going to comment?
Well, yeah, I mean, can you hear me okay? I was just going to give a strong second to what you said, Karen, that this is really about, I think it's an unreasonable conclusion to reach that the FAA got 450 right across the board on the first go on this accelerated timeline. I think we all acknowledge, including the FAA, that they didn't get everything 100% right. And we have an opportunity as a community, as an industry, to provide our expert counsel based on practical, real feedback and operational experience on where there could be improvements to the regs. And that can happen in a very gradual, transparent way that is not disruptive. And to do this it's bigger than any single operator. We really need to lay the foundation for establishing a rulemaking regime that is modernized, efficient, works well, protects public safety, and enables, safe space transportation to proceed. And so what the group has done, I think you've done an excellent job sort of laying out very tailored, very specific, recommendations on improvements that can be made that are not wholesale. This is not a wide-ranging revision of the regs. It's a very specific, tailored set of recommendations based on real-world feedback from applicants that have gone through the process. And I think that benefits the entire community. And it would just encourage my colleagues on the line to, support as well.
I've got a comment and question. So I agree with everything that's being said. I definitely think that improving what's already successful is important. I don't want to throw a wrench into the entire conversation here, but something that keeps coming to my mind that Avon's been struggling with is our use of AI in our launch vehicle systems. In some ways that, and the regulations aren't even talking about that type of variability. So, what do you do when a system can decide mid-flight? How do you regulate intelligence, decision-making matrices, and those are all, I think, things that need to be regulated, and I don't even think we're into talking about that. So maybe that's another task for the future, but that's certainly something that Avon would like to see more regulation on as somebody who is being regulated. With that said, I guess I think going way back to the topic of who's the authority, is it range or FAA? I think there is a specific section of the report I made a comment. I think it's on page 3. The first paragraph, at the end of the first paragraph on page 3. It says it discusses where an operator subject to range requirements, FAA should accept ranges review. Is the opposite of that true? Well, because in our experience is not. And so how can we make a recommendation there that also encourages FAA to like propose the opposite, work with the range so that the opposite is also true, where if FAA, if it's purely commercial and federal range isn't being used, how can we make it so that range accepts FAA's reviews?
Sorry, Jay, it took me a minute to get to my mute button. I'll note that I think that the challenge there is again who has authority here, and we're talking about authorities right now that are under Title 51, right, with the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And I'm sure that Dr. Neal would have loved to be able to tell his Space Force or then Air Force friends exactly what they should do and where they should get in line with regard to who had priority with regard to the rules. The challenge, of course, is that you have kind of competing authorities there, and that is an issue that has to kind of be worked out, I think, at either directly with the Space Force in the sense of engaging with the NDAA, engaging with Space Force, engaging with the DoD to address their approach to implementing their requirements with the range versus the FAA ability to override them. And so I think, the reason that this recommendation is worded the way it is because this goes to FAA, how the FAA chooses to deal with information that it receives versus being able to dictate to the another agency what it does with that information. Dr. Neal, feel free to please tell me that I'm wrong, that you didn't see that happen, but I certainly respect that you had to fight those battles.
That's very true, and it needs to continue to be worked at the very highest level. AST isn't necessarily in the position to be able to make the change. It's going to require more senior folks along the chain. But frankly, a workaround, if you want to think about it that way, is that there is no requirement for a range. And so to the extent that new vehicles can operate from spaceports other than Cape Canaveral and Mars and Vandenberg, they potentially could not have this problem, or at least not as severely. So if you want to fly from Boca Chica, great. If you want to fly from the Blue Origin site in West Texas, great. And there's plenty of other new spaceports that are either licensed or want to be that. It doesn't work for all the big vehicles today, but it's something we can think about strategically in long term.
Thanks.
Janice,
Janice?
I actually wanted to go back just to clarify Karen's comment earlier on how this would be implemented in the meantime. So I just want to clarify, you're saying those on existing licenses could continue under those licenses, right? Those already pursuing or have 450 could continue to do so. And those starting a new license could either choose the old regs or the new regs? Is that what?
No, you would have to operate under the regs as they exist. So anybody starting, so if the FAA were to initiate a rulemaking process, or even COMSTAC just approves this recommendation that they do so, until what would happen here is if you opened up 450 right now and you flip to say 450, like I'm just going to pick 450.43, which is a concern about the current definition of payload with regard to suborbital vehicles. And you looked at the definition of payload right now as it is, what would be in a draft regulation would be an amendment to that text that would, say, change the definition from this to read that. And until that was passed into a final rule, you would have to operate under the existing regulation. So you're stuck with the existing regulation that's apparently deficient for suborbital vehicles until a final rule is passed. And then 450 would stand largely as it is, but there would be these tweaks, for example, a change to the definition of payload that you would then get to benefit from once a final rule is implemented and that is adopted. So it's an interesting one, because like there are things about 450 that definitively won't be changed, and we would all have to operate under, unless you could say get a waiver, which is becoming more and more difficult, another conversation, until the final rule was passed amending language in 450.
Just to follow up on that, though, excuse me, just to follow up on that, now, in the law, the Secretary of Transportation can issue a waiver on any of the regulations. And so if they're not receptive to that, we need to work on that. But potentially a waiver, especially one that is common sense, come on, guys, industry agrees, AST agrees, let's not have to use the existing regulation until we fix it. If it's not appropriate, that would be another much faster and easier way than waiting potentially 5 to 7 years before it finally can be fixed. So again, not to say we shouldn't make the regulation correct, but there are other ways that this can be looked at. And I support John's comments about policy and direction and advisory circulars, and frankly, management judgment. Lawyers have a very important role to play in all this, but they don't necessarily get to decide everything. So again, there can be conversations about what's the right thing to do going forward. And it sounds like this is an important topic.
Yeah, Karina Dries, Ted Mercer here. I'm going to have to drop off. I'm sorry. I've got a UAG meeting that's starting here in about 2 minutes. So I need to drop off and do that. Thank you for allowing me to participate.
Yeah, thank you, sir. We obviously still have, folks that have comments. Like, I guess I feel like we have a couple different options here. We can take a look at the proposed recommendations and see if they're worth, modifying, tweaking, or adding to, or whatever. We could just take a pause and say, this obviously needs more work and more input from COMSTAC members on the white paper that's been circulated since March, probably, or before, or we call a vote. I guess those are the three options we have before us now. It sounds like, there's a lot of folks that are not comfortable voting in favor of this for various reasons. So I guess I'm kind of leaning toward just taking a pause and going back to the drawing board with the regulatory working group, unless folks want to propose a different option. Mike?
I was thinking we do something similar to maybe what we did on the learning period, where I think there is consensus on the need for changes and updates across 450, and perhaps there's maybe some disagreement on some of the specific regs and sort of calling them out individually. And perhaps there's a path here where we have some overall consensus on the need for updates and the need for more clarity, but then perhaps we reflect that specific members from their experience, say X, Y, Z. Anyway, I think in short, perhaps we go back to a little more work for those interested parties who talk to data, but with the goal of approval of something in the short term, because I think there is shared interest across. I think there's unanimous consent on, clarification. Perhaps there's just some nuance to that.
Jay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I see multiple hands raised, so wasn't sure. I think the dialogue is super helpful. I think the discussion, this is what discussion should be about. I didn't catch Karina's second option. What was the second option here?
So see if we can iterate on the current list of recommendations, which we might be kind of running out of time for that because we still have Jim's slides to get to. we could take a vote as it stands today, or we could say we're going to take a pause. We're not going to vote on it just yet. We're going to ask the regulatory working group to continue iterating on the task and continue this task through November.
For what it's worth, I think for me, I would be satisfied with just making the 2 changes and then voting on it. I don't think it's helpful to just kind of sit on this. Because at least from my side, there isn't significant change. So the real-time language update and voting is something that would be good. To that end, I had one suggestion to the range FAA question. So I was never suggesting that any organization should override the other. But I think I found what we can do. So on page 3 at the end of the first paragraph, if we can just add or recommend that maybe FAA be more specific about which parts of which clauses of 450 would be replaced if range is if an operator is subject to range requirements. That would be super helpful, because an operator would be subject to range requirements if they're using range assets, or if it's somehow going to impact range operations, or potentially cause damage to personnel or property, right? So it's pretty clear when an operator is subject to range requirements. And so when that happens, it should automatically trigger some sort of list that says, well, these Part 450 regs then are overwritten by range requirements, or FAA will follow range requirements for these sections of 450. That would drastically reduce the burden on FAA, because then operators can just skip those sections and follow 91.710 or whatever other range requirements that are active. This is an opinion that I would love opening up for discussion. If we don't want to add that, that's fine too. And then I'm happy.
All right, Jay, thank you. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I think I have something that might be helpful here. So, we haven't had any discussion about the recommendations or the what's behind the recommendations being an issue. There's agreement that there are things that need to be fixed. Thank you Karen, for explaining the process to me and your patience with me, helping me understand that. And I appreciate Matt's comments and things you had to say. Perhaps we could, here's a list of things FAA that are challenged with 450. Ultimately, they need to be probably updated in the regulation, somehow amended or changed to be corrected. In the meantime, because that's a process that takes years potentially, there need to be policies and perhaps more circulars, other actions taken to address these things. And as we take those actions, that will better inform what we need to ultimately put into 450. So I guess the challenge that I have with maybe the way that it is prioritized is that here's some things that are wrong, go fix 450. And that's going to be a process that's going to take years. So in the meantime, we ought to suggest to the FAA they come up with ways of dealing with that and let those ways inform how 450 ultimately is changed. And that kind of a tenor to this thing would make me comfortable.
Hear, hear.
Okay, I'm gonna drop into the chat a modification to the last sentence of the text that speaks to this issue in about 2 seconds, and hopefully that might address it. So thank you, John, because I think I can capture what you're saying in a way that balances the idea of pursuing advisory circulars while thinking about changes to the reg.
All right, well, while Karen's writing, are there any other issues we need to discuss with this particular task? If we can satisfy what Jay's talking about, what John's talking about, I'm a little bit more optimistic that we might be able to vote on this today. I'd love to be able to do that and give this feedback back to FAA that they're asking for. So if folks have other concerns, please raise them now.
I have one final comment, and I know I keep adding stuff, but I actually wrote this. The 10-day business days, 10 business days of submission requirement on rule section 413.11. I mean, is it worth exploring whether 10 days is realistic? Just real quick. I mean, what's with the 2-week response timeline? Is there rationale behind that? If it's arbitrary, I think maybe 15. Sometimes it takes a week to coordinate meetings.
Yeah, so the idea here, and I don't remember who submitted this, but certainly important to have clear timeframes. So this is once an application is actually submitted, and this means you've put together an application packet, that means you've been going through pre-application approval with the FAA. It means that you probably have, hopefully, standing meetings with the FAA on a bi-weekly basis. So all things that I think people here have experienced. And so now you've vetted your application and approval, and now you have submitted it, and the review that they're going to do is, have I received not the substance that I need to complete this review, but when I look at the checklist of documentation that's necessary, are those things reflected here such that I can begin the review of the substance? And that time frame is one that many applicants, even before 450, but with 450, are reporting significant challenges with. So, 10 days, look, I don't personally, if I had put the 10 days in, it would be because I would think we should put something in as a starting point, such that the FAA would then say, okay, look, this is a problem, and what is a reasonable approach? And then they're going to publish an NPRM, and then we're going to have iterations on it potentially. But it certainly is an attempt to be indicative of a need to expeditiously provide feedback, because that period is really ambiguous, and it can be a period of time that could eat through months and months and months of time as they're preparing to decide whether you're complete enough before triggering the 180-day clock that is the statutory clock. So there's a lot of tomfoolery that happens around the application process, and this is one of the places that it occurs that causes a lot of headaches for applicants. And I didn't think I'd get to use tomfoolery today, but I'm very pleased that I did. Okay, I'm about to drop that note, John, sorry.
If you all are able to read some of the recent comments in the chat, it would be helpful from an operator's perspective if you're able to respond to this.
All right, I just dropped that last sentence on clarifying that they should use advisory circulars, policy documents, and proceed with those in the course of their efforts. I'll note Jay on your comment. I think that I honestly actually think that, to the point of like what could be an advisory circular versus what is a rule change, that actually is probably a pretty good use of an advisory circular, in the sense that if an advisory circular were to say in looking at the range requirements and in understanding those, if you fulfill these, then those would be accepted. That doesn't get out of the idea that the FAA would review, right? They're not going to take it and say, now we're not going to look at it. I'm not saying that would happen, but I do think that I read what you're saying as being aligned with the idea of an advisory circular that would say, fulfilling this, whether it's a standard or whether it's another requirement, another agency would be considered equivalent to would fulfill the requirements under the regulation.
Hey, Carolyn, it's Mike. I think just the comment you wrote about the clarification for supporting with both advisory circulars and the other Sparks one, I'm happy with that language. I think taking the specific wording of what you're supposed to do next out, the concept of we need to be improving and refining Part 450 is something to wholeheartedly support, right? So I think letting all avenues stay open is fine.
Thanks. Any concerns? Does this reverse course on anybody? John, I honestly put this to bed. So if this could be helpful, that would be wonderful.
I'm trying to understand, Karen, where this comment goes. Is it in the charts or is it in the document?
Oh, sorry. It's in the document in the last paragraph, which is the paragraph that speaks to the recommendation that COMSTAC supports the sparks that are underway and the needs attention.
And where does it go in that paragraph? Just at the end of it?
Yeah, at the very end on page 3. It's right above the chart.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
And I'm happy to change perfection to improving or improvement.
Okay. Yeah, could we put just in the this is a suggestion in the first sentence, it says finally as indicated above and reflected in the recommendations below, just some word like over time regulation changes will be necessary or something. Eventually, or I'm open to other words, but just I'm trying to get the thought in there that ultimately we got to change the regulation. In the meantime, we got to clarify this stuff so people can actually get their licenses and get working.
That seems totally reasonable to me.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I'll pop it there and come back to you real quick.
Okay.
And then with regards to the comments on range requirements and AST competitions, I think, I think that's its own tasker, right? There are so many nuances. You could open the barn door. I could be at, Joe Bob's Alligator Ranch and Range Safety Office that says, I don't have to have any rules, and something that says I follow those and I can ignore AST. That shouldn't fly, right? So I think we should go deeper before we change anything or make a strong recommendation on overlap between range safety and AST range safety.
Okay. Clarifying guidance balanced with regulatory changes.
Yeah, that works even for an engineer.
Yay! All right, I saw a lot of thumbs up, and I just got a big approval by an engineer. So, Brenda, can we move to approve this maybe?
John, would you and maybe should we try to display the slides again to see if we can try to make some of these changes to the recommendations? If we can vote on the recommendations, I think we can continue, iterating on the white paper itself. It's really the recommendations that the FAA is looking for today.
Okay. Can you go to the next page of the recommendations? Just want to look at them together real quick. Page 12, yep. Okay, so I think that what we can amend is this third bullet here. Well, actually the clarification, so we could say clarification through, guidance. As well as reforms, balanced with reforms.
Guidance, policy, and reforms.
Yep. Does that work? Do you want, I feel like guidance and policy balanced with reforms. So through guidance and policy. Always feel sorry for the scribe.
Good with that.
The very end of the, yeah, right before balanced and policy.
Guidance and policy.
Guidance, yeah. Guidance and policy balanced with reforms. Okay. It reflects that sentiment, I believe. Yep, John's shaking his head yes. All right. Good stuff. All right, Karina.
I think that's good. Jay, do you want to look at the ACs again in the prior slide?
I actually think there's a duplicative one here. I think the second bullet and the fourth bullet are kind of duplicative. Not that that's a problem, because I don't think anybody disagrees with either of them, but just want to point that out.
Can we do something with the third bullet to get the same spirit of change in Part 450, but in the meantime, having some policy to help us navigate it?
Yeah. How about we just say clarify and revise as needed to address? So the FAA should clarify and revise, comma, and amend and as needed amend and then I think you can delete revise. So clarify and comma as needed amend 450 to address challenges with requirements that are distinct. Includes both options. And then okay.
Does anyone disagree with these changes?
All good.
Are we ready to call for a vote or not quite yet? Anybody have any other comments?
All right, seeing some thumbs up. Speak now, or let's go to vote.
All right, anybody want to make a motion in a second?
I'll move to vote.
So moved.
Okay, so I got Megan Mitchell with the motion, Matt Dunn with the second. Let me just take some notes. I don't know if Mike's still on. We have a UAG meeting simultaneously.
Yeah,
So,
I'm on Karina.
okay, do you want to do a roll call, Mike?
Sure. I'm just going to go to the full COMSTAC list here. Just I know people have dropped on and off, but I'll just pause a second if no one answers. But start with Bolton. DePete, I think neither are on. Dries,
I vote yes.
Dunn,
Yes.
Elbin,
Yes.
Frigo,
Yes.
French, I'll vote yes. Jaw, Jones, Ketchum,
Yes.
Cronmiller,
Yes.
Mercer, Mitchell,
Yes.
Moses,
Vote yes.
Newman, Neal,
Yes.
Pricer,
Yes.
Shenaway,
Yes.
Simpson still on. Simpson.
Yes.
I think Sid is not here. Skylas,
Yes.
Sister Rahman, Starzik,
Yes.
Strickland, Zoller,
Yes.
Solkowski.
Yes.
All right, the ayes have it. Karina.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your participation in this entire conversation. It's been, very helpful to have everyone's comments come forward, be able to work these concerns out in real time. I really do appreciate everyone working together to make that happen. I do think, this is going to be really valuable feedback to the FAA as they're kind of looking for specific feedback on 450. So I think this will be really useful to them. And I really appreciate everyone's effort to make this happen. Karen, I know this has been sort of a long project for you, and we'll try to go easy on you with the next task, but I really appreciate all the effort that you put into this to make this happen.
Yeah, thanks everybody for hanging in there today and getting the job done. So thank you all for your inputs and for your support. And yeah, I'll take an easy one next time.
Okay, got it. All right, Jim, back over to you. Thanks so much.
All right, just real quick, thank you, everybody. Greatly appreciate it. As the guy responsible for rules and AC, I am taking this feedback and I am not taking it personally. So I hope there were no punches pulled, but I greatly appreciate the discussion. As far as I'm concerned, this is probably the best COMSTAC meeting we've had because we have had that discussion, and I greatly appreciate everyone that had comments. That's going to make 450 better, us better, and we'll be able to help you all to be better and more innovative and efficient and carrying on into space, into that next frontier. So there are 2 more tasks coming that we have already identified. One I talked about last time was the lessons learned information system. I will send out more information on that. And then also there will be the recommended practices for human spaceflight occupant safety. That will be coming. Mike, I believe I got an email from you asking when that was going to be available. I am hoping to get it to you on or before 1 August. There will be some holes in there with some specific questions for COMSTAC to say, hey, I need this information. What do you recommend to put in this blank spot? So it's going to be a whole lot more than just, hey, review this and make sure their grammar is correct. So looking forward to get that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks. And for the safety working group, we'll stand by and be ready to turn that around quickly for you.
Great. I appreciate it. And with that, Mike O'Donnell, did you have anything to add before we close this?
I would say excellent meeting, great dialogue, great conversation. We appreciate the input. We don't take it personally. We want to be better. And you guys are helping us to get better, and I appreciate it. And I know Kelvin does too. So thank you all for your service on the COMSTAC.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. I know there's other meetings, so I appreciate it. And this COMSTAC meeting is now adjourned. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.